Today, this weekend actually, marks yet another sad anniversary for our nation. At least many of us think so. It was a year ago yesterday that a group of white supremacists gathered for a Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. They were protesting the removal of Confederate statues from public areas in Charlottesville and elsewhere in the South. And on the first night of their rally, the news media captured images of white men, mostly men, in khakis and polo shirts, carrying lit torches as they marched through the historic University of Virginia campus, shouting, "You will not replace us. Jews will not replace us." The next day, 1 year ago today, as protesters and counter-protesters clashed, there was chaos and confusion in the streets, and ultimately one of the rally's supporters, James Alex Fields Jr., drove his car directly into a group of the counter-protesters, killing 32-year-old Heather Heyer. By the end of the day, 2 police officers would die as well in a helicopter crash just outside the city as they worked to keep the peace. Over 30 people were injured. Heather Heyer was a paralegal for a local law firm and a voice for justice in her community. She was a regular participant in movements for change and was known by her friends, her coworkers, her family for her tireless commitment to causes of peace. This is a tragic anniversary for our country, but Heather's family is today marking the first anniversary of their daughter's death. It's personal for them, and they have spent this year committing themselves to be her voice in the world. Scholarships are being given in Heather's name at her own high school and the one in Charlottesville, and also to graduate students who are dedicating their studies to causes of social justice. Heather's mother, Susan Bro, says her daily life is vastly different a year later as she interviews with major media outlets and continues to press for justice in Heather's memory. Susan has now become a spokeswoman against racism and white supremacy, noting that she is just now waking up to a reality too many of her African American sisters and brothers and others in this country have lived with for generations. Susan Bro says the events of 2017 in Charlottesville opened up old wounds that have been with us for too long. And to those of us who are her white brothers and sisters, she says, we are already a minority in the rest of the world and soon will be in our own country. So we really need to get our act together on how we treat so-called minorities if we're so worried about becoming one. It took her daughter's death for Susan Bro to become the activist she is and for her to hear the truth in what Heather used to say to so many people: if you're not outraged, you're not paying attention. Like many of us, Susan's life went along pretty much unaffected by the troubles of others until it became personal, until her own tears mingled with those of countless other mothers, generations of mothers, whose children's blood has been shed because the sins of history repeat themselves over and over again. How many children have to die before we get our act together on how we treat each other? For how many of us does it have to get personal before we pay attention? Charlottesville is just a convenient illustration because of the anniversary this weekend. Earlier this week, 664 pairs of empty shoes were displayed on the steps of the Wisconsin State Capitol building. That's how many lives, how many persons were lost to gun violence in our state in 2016. August 6 and 8 were the anniversaries of the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, both 73 years ago. It's estimated over 200,000 people were killed or injured in just those two events. But it's also possible we'll never know the full extent of those tragedies. Those are two more examples just because they're convenient. There could easily be more. People who study violence and violent acts tell us it's easier to tolerate violence in the abstract. It's easier to be violent toward another person when you stop thinking of them as a person, when you dehumanize them, refer to the numbers of people who've lost their lives to gun violence rather than recite their names. If you're pulling the trigger or driving the car, don't aim for a person with a name. Give them some other name: enemy, combatant, target, threat. They are an other. In today's reading from Genesis, Hagar's name matters. While it's the name given to Abraham and Sarah's servant, literally their slave, in Hebrew it's actually the masculine form of a word for alien or foreigner or sojourner or one who takes flight. It's a name that is given, likely by a man, to a woman who is an other, and an Egyptian at that. It's easier that way to highlight the differences, the otherness. So even though Sarah sees the son of Hagar, Ishmael, playing with her son Isaac, what she says to Abraham is this: cast out this slave woman with her son. Cast her out, throw her away, discard her, get rid of her. She is nothing. So Abraham, whose name means father of nations, does as Sarah, whose name means the princess, dictates. He he casts out this slave woman along with her child. Now, there's a lot to love about Abraham and Sarah. Their journey from the land of Ur to the land of Canaan is remarkable, trusting in a God who pulled promises out of thin air, land, a place to call home, descendants as numerous as the stars. Their hospitality to passers-by is legendary. When good news comes their way, Sarah giggles, and their child Isaac is born of laughter. Abraham and Sarah are the foreparents of the Judeo-Christian tradition. History moves forward because of them. But it would also appear history takes a few steps backward as well. You see, there are many traits we should be proud to inherit from Abraham and Sarah, but their cruelty toward Hagar and Ishmael is far from the best they have to offer us. And yet, whether the conversation is about immigration, gun violence, white supremacy, racial injustice, political difference, our ability to dehumanize the other is among our most human of instincts, our most natural of inclinations. How many mothers' children have to suffer before we learn how to care for each other? How personal does it need to get for us to begin to understand the consequences of our collective cruelty? If Sarah and Abraham had realized how personal their actions would get, I wonder if it would have made a difference in the choices they made. It turns out what they say about karma is true. It's a real pain. And it would take a couple of generations to get there, but the same family of God's people would find themselves on the receiving end of a story more akin to Hagar and Ishmael's experience than they or we may care to admit. Let's review. Hagar was an Egyptian slave in a Hebrew household, a foreigner in a strange land. Her life and her sons were endangered not because of anything they did or who they were as people, but because they were considered expendable to those in power. Cast out, deported with not even so much as enough food or water to sustain them, they were made to wander in the wilderness, crying out to God in their despair. Sound familiar? It should. It's the story of the Exodus, except Abraham and Sarah play the role of Pharaoh, having no idea that their great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter, Moses' mother, will have to hide her own son in a basket to save his life, without a thought that their descendants would become slaves themselves and wander hungry and thirsty for generations in the wilderness. And it's that experience of being a people without name, without power, without home, that informs the core teaching of the Hebrew faith. Exodus 22:21-23. You shall not wrong or oppress a resident alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. You shall not abuse any widow or orphan. If you do abuse them when they cry out to me, I will heed their cry. And it's that core teaching, that commandment, that informs Jesus' summation of the greatest commandment. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. African-American womanist theologian Renita Weems suggests Hagar would have benefited from a sister in her hour of need. A sister. Maybe not a blood relation, but someone, anyone, who might have acted not from a position of otherness, but from a place of compassion. A sister. Someone who would see her as a human being. A sister. Someone who would look on her experience and, if it wasn't exactly a shared experience, might ask themselves at least, if it were, how might I hope to be treated? Hagar would have benefited from a sister, but she got Sarah, our ancestor in faith, instead, who was blind to how personal this was going to get, even for her own family, her own offspring, her own descendants. How many children will it take, one wonders, before we understand how intertwined all our stories really are, before it's personal enough to make a difference for us? It's been said we don't inherit this earth, we borrow it from our children and our children's children. If Sarah had known that, if she had really understood that, might she have treated Hagar and her son Ishmael differently? Woman to woman, mother to mother, sister to sister? Ultimately, the cry God hears in the wilderness is that of the child who suffers not because of anything he or she has done, but because of the sins of those who've come before. How many cries from how many children will it take? Here's another mother and child story for us to consider. For the past 17 days, a female orca in the Pacific Ocean has been carrying the dead body of her child, her calf, over a distance of at least 1,000 miles. The birth of her calf, the first birth in her community since 2015, was a hopeful sign for her pod, whose numbers have dwindled in recent years to as few as 75, thanks in great part to the pollution of the waters in which they swim, the shipping lanes established through their hunting grounds, and the overall lack of salmon. It's typical for these whales to grieve their dead. Scientists are used to seeing females carry their dead for a day or two before letting go. But for 17 days, this mother, whose scientific designation as J35 was replaced by the Cherokee name Tahlequah, which means two is enough. She refused to part with her child, attracting the attention of scientists, the media, the world. An article in the Washington Post remarked how people wrote poems about Tahlequah and drew pictures. People lost sleep thinking about the whale. A scientist cried thinking about her. That's news. Tahlequah inspired politicians and essayists, and a sense of interspecies kinship in some mothers who had also lost children. If you haven't seen the news yet, spoiler alert. Earlier today, the director of the Center for Whale Research emailed the Seattle Times the news that at long last, J35, notice she's no longer referred to as Tahlequah, was observed swimming alone with her pod. Looking vigorous and healthy, her ordeal with grief finally over, thank goodness. An exact quote. How quickly these things can change for us. Our willingness to grant each other names, to acknowledge each other's grief, or to feel each other's pain. How many children will it take, or orcas, or species, or generations, or cries before we fully comprehend? The thing of it is, for God, it's personal. It's always personal for God, personal enough for God to understand intimately the cries of those who grieve, the sons whose lives are at risk because of the whims of the so-called powerful, the daughters whose names God calls out in love. God listens for the cries of the other. May God open our ears, our eyes, our hearts, our minds as we consider the others, our brothers, our sisters, all of God's good creation, and decide how it is we will journey through this life together. Amen.